Imagine that it's September 1970. You're on board flight LL-219, seated just a few rows behind Lila Khalid. You both are operating under the PFLP. Khalid has prior experiences with hijacking operations, but you don't. Your presence is intentional though. You're assigned as a part of an operational team to demonstrate the PFLP's use of non-Palestinian militants in its actions. At that time, you're largely unknown outside the organization, and your involvement in the operation is the only time in which you ever enter historical records in any visible way. Patrick Argüello was born in San Francisco and moved to Nicaragua when he was 3. He ended up staying there for a while, but his family ultimately left the country during the Somoza dictatorship, joining a larger wave of political exiles opposed to that regime at that time. He ended up growing up in the US in really left-leaning political spaces, primarily influenced by anti-dictatorship movements, opposition to the Vietnam War, and just general support for revolutionary movements abroad. After graduating from UCLA, Argüello decided to study medicine in Chile in 1967. While studying, he was heavily affected by the deaths of several of his Nicaraguan friends who had died in the FSLN, a revolutionary group opposing the Somoza dictatorship. He decided to return to Nicaragua and he tried working with the FSLN, but the founder Fonseca limited his involvement due to his suspicion of Patrick's American background. In early 1970, the FSLN sought military training from foreign groups that connected with the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Argüello trained in the DFLP camps near Amman, Jordan from April to June 1970 alongside other Nicaraguans. This was the experience that ultimately led him to joining the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. By this period, a lot of political groups operated across borders. Members would travel between countries, train with foreign organizations, and join movements outside of their home nations, often seeing different countries and conflicts as a part of a singular, interconnected struggle. And within that landscape, Palestine held a particular weight. The PFLP actively recruited foreign militants, and Argüello entered that movement through that process. He was trained by the organization and then deployed accordingly. Argüello's involvement makes a lot more sense when he's placed alongside others operating at that time. Lila Khalid, for example, was already established within the PFLP due to her participation in earlier hijackings. Politically, she aligned herself with the group's Marxist-Leninist framework and its emphasis on armed struggles as a means of internationalizing the Palestinian cause. At the same time, the Japanese Red Army, led by Fusaku Shigenobu, was working closely with Palestinian organizations. Shigenobu's politics were rooted in revolutionary communism and anti-imperialism, the belief that attacks carried out abroad could weaken global systems supporting the US and Israeli power. Therefore, Japanese militants trained in Middle Eastern camps and took part in operations far from Japan under that logic. And so across these groups, several positions overlapped. That the US involvement in foreign governments, wars, and security forces was viewed as a part of the same power struggle, regardless of the region. That violence against state and civilian targets was accepted as a method of pressuring governments and attracting international attention. And finally, that participation was based on ideological alignment rather than nationality. Argüello falls directly within that environment. He was born in Nicaragua, raised in the US, and now operating under a Palestinian militant organization. The operation in question was the attempted hijacking of LL Flight 219, traveling from Amsterdam to New York. And this was a part of a PFLP campaign in September 1970, in which 4 commercial airlines bound for New York and 1 for London were hijacked and targeted. 3 of the planes were forced to land in Dawson Field in Jordan at success, while Flight 219, carrying Patrick Argüello and Lila Khalid, was stopped and diverted to London Heathrow. During this period, the PFLP used airline hijackings to demand the release of Palestinian prisoners and force international attention onto the conflict. LL flights were frequent targets because they were an Israeli airline, they carried Israeli passengers, and they were protected by Israeli security personnel posing as crew or passengers. Shortly after Argüello and Khalid initiated the hijacking attempt, the undercover Israeli air marshals confronted Leila and Patrick, and gunfire broke out in the cabin area. Argüello was shot during the incident and later died from his injuries. The aircraft remained under Israeli control and landed without being diverted, meaning that the objectives of the operation, hostage leverage and negotiating concessions, were not achieved. Leila Khalid was taken into custody in the UK and then later released during a prisoner exchange. There's really little public available knowledge about Argüello's activities beyond this operation. I wasn't able to find any detailed records of his training or rank or any future assignments under the PFLP. Following the hijacking, Leila Khalid became somewhat widely recognized figure. Photographs, interviews, and media coverage establish her as a recurring presence in the discussions of Palestinian militancy. But it's safe to say that Argüello did not receive comparable attention. He only really appears in incident reports or secondary histories or just references connected directly to Khalid or the hijacker itself, which wasn't an uncommon thing in militant movements of that time. Public attention focused on the figures who survived. But Patrick's significance lies in what his case illustrates rather than his personal notoriety. Argüello was truly a part of a broader pattern common to the late Cold War militancy. Individuals joining armed organizations outside of their country of origin based on their political alignment rather than nationality. And for all those who didn't survive or become well known, their involvement was usually only mentioned like once or twice, very briefly at that time, and mostly faded from any type of historical records. But I thought his case provided a lot of insight into how these organizations function in practice, from the recruitment to the deployment, and why only certain figures remain visible in later narratives.